Great. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to see you. Welcome to this afternoon session of Keeping Community Cool. We are really looking forward to present to you thoughts, visions, solutions, interventions from around the world. And we have collected a very strong panel to share their insights. But I would actually like to frame this session with two presentations from Sami from the World Bank. Sami is the Director of Europe and Central Asia, and Sami will be followed by our Chief Sustainability Officer, Joe Da Silva, which will frame the session around Arab's capability. So Sami, would you like to take my seat here and introduce yourself in greater details around this specific topic? Thank you, Sami.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Sameh Wahba. I'm the Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia for what we call the Planet Department, which is basically environment, social development, water, agriculture, and climate change. And I used to be the Global Director for cities, disaster risk management, and land, which is probably the background that I bring more into this conversation, a little bit of both. But I wanted to make really 4 points here. The first is about extreme heat and the impact that it has in terms of health and productivity. The second point is about the interlinkages between heat and air quality and air pollution. The third is about the inequality that extreme heat brings, the fact that it affects the poor more disproportionately, and then more or less a bit of framing the stage of what can be done about it, basically the good, the bad, and the ugly. So in terms of extreme heat, the analytics we've done at the World Bank basically suggest that as the world heats up by 2 degrees, and we seem to be slipping past the 1.5 degrees, basically 3.8 billion people around the globe will be subjected to bouts of heat that normally exceed their physiological limits. That's mostly in Asia, but also in Africa. I mean, we're talking about 2 billion in South Asia, 1 billion in East Asia, and 800 million in Sub-Saharan Africa. We know that basically 500,000 deaths from excess heat globally have been occurring on average in the past 2 decades. And we know from a quantification perspective, since Joe asked me to try to really somewhat quantify the challenge, is that the impact of urban heat island effect is anywhere between 1.4 to 1.7% of GDP. That's how much it shaves in terms of productivity with a compounding effects of climate change. We did recently a study on the Western Balkans, so that's the 6 countries of Albania, North Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, and so on, the region, Kosovo, and basically average summer temperature may surge by about 7.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. I mean, this is one of the most affected regions. Now, this will, the modeling that we've done is that anywhere, the deaths related to extreme heat will increase by 5 to 10% by the end of the century. And we know that the toll that it will take on the productivity of workers, especially those that work on outside jobs that are more exposed to heat, will be affected anywhere between 25 to up to 65% in terms of lost productivity. And then we know that some of those cities, in particular cities like Tirana, Sarajevo, and Skopje, and Mostar, among others, will face extreme heats. Now, together with extreme heat, there's an impact in terms of air quality associated with the fact that, as extreme heat coupled with stagnant air temperatures, basically worsens air quality, and of course the association via water scarcity and droughts, which could lead to increased risk of wildfires, and with it the plumes of smoke, etc. So that's another compounding factor that we know. And then the third thing that we know that matters to us a lot at the World Bank is the impact on poor people, because heat mapping affects the poor and the vulnerable. Sorry, heat mapping that we've done shows that the poor and the vulnerable are more affected in general. I mean, you will probably all have seen the studies that happened in American cities. These were widely mediatized, that poor neighborhoods, because of the permeability of the surfaces, because of the lack of green cover, etc., tend to be anywhere between 10 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than richer neighborhoods. And the same data, again, in our West Balkan studies, suggested that the temperature differences could be as wide as 6 degrees Celsius. In fact, in the city of Mostar in particular, that we've done studies with surveying. We got volunteers and they went around city to collect temperatures. And in the city of Mostar, whom some of you might know, the famous Mostar Bridge, the big symbol of reconciliation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, actually the difference in temperature was 8.2 degrees Celsius in one city. So what is it that can be done about it? And I know Joe will take these points into far greater detail and in a much more enriching way. But basically, from an urban perspective, you've got the places dimension, that you can do a lot in place, whether it's urban design, it's the way we build, it's the way we design buildings, passive energy design, the cooling systems, how we use water and vegetation. So basically anywhere between architectural design, landscape design, urban design, and urban planning could all have major impact on the way we shape places for cooler temperatures. We've got a lot to do on people as well. So, I mean, how do we, prevent people's exposure to bouts of extreme heat? What do we do about that in terms of heat management, in terms of mainstreaming, risk management procedures across the various sectors? And then, of course, there's quite a bit on institutions, policies, and strategies that would need to happen at the city level. Now, the good news is, with a lot of, if you will, smaller investments or smarter investments. So, I mean, take, for instance, the city of Freetown in Sierra Leone. I mean, it's a city under the leadership of the mayor, decided to plant 1 million trees. And, with that, she's achieved, a range of issues together. One, she's done it under a payment for environmental services structure, which basically supports the livelihoods of poor people who care for those trees and monitor their growth, etc. But also she's used the planting of those trees to reduce flooding. It increases tree cover, to reduce extreme heat. And of course, it helps in carbon sequestration. So, I mean, it's, planting trees, you tend to think is an obvious thing. You'd wonder why it's not happening more, predominantly than that. We've got examples where, a re-landscaping, so something like the famous Cheonggyecheong stream, for those of you who visited Seoul in Korea, I mean, that was basically a stream that was then, covered over, built an elevated highway, dismantled again, returning the stream in a non-natural format. Of course, the water continuity was gone, but temperatures dropped between 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, not to mention that apparently traffic improved as well. So lots of co-benefits that emerge from thinking about these types of solutions. But with that, I'll hand it over to the real expert, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Sami, very much for those opening remarks. And I think what's really interesting is, Sami's from the World Bank and, a big financial institution, and I come from ARUP, which is a planning, engineering, design organization, and I'm a practitioner. And yet, what's amazing about this agenda is that the thinking that is coming from those two worlds is really very much converging, which is very different to so much of the climate debate to date. I want to start in an unusual place. I was thinking about this talk on my way back from Cape Town last week and reminded of a conversation 20 years ago with Jürgen Randers. And Jürgen Randers did his PhD, which resulted in the Club of Rome report. So he's a real guru, an elder of this movement. And we were talking 20 years ago and saying, what temperature does it have to reach for the world to wake up to the severity of this problem? And we came to the conclusion it was 1 degree. And he went and then did some work called the 1 degree wall, which I recommend you look up. But the point is, we're now at 1.5 degrees. And we've asked the wrong question. What we should have asked is what extreme events need to happen that are unequivocally a result of climate change, so there's no question of attribution, for the world to wake up and take action. And the answer, unfortunately, is extreme heat. And the world has woken up. because widespread and intense and extended heat waves, and all three adjectives matter, have hit every continent in the past year. This is an everywhere problem that possibly could unify people around this agenda. At least 10 countries have recorded daily temperatures of more than 50 degrees in more than one location, which is amazing. Now, July, the 2024, was the hottest. Just seeing if this works, sorry. Can someone fix the slides? July 2024 was the hottest month ever on record since global records began, and that was in 1850. And elsewhere, what we're finding is rising temperatures have resulted then in secondary effects of extreme rainfall, which we saw in Spain and in Brazil, or tropical storms that have devastated communities this year in the Caribbean and Southeast Asia. So it's the pinnacle of the extreme events, and it will get worse. 3 years ago, at COP26, slide please, there was an agreement that 1.5 was a safe ceiling. That was 3 years ago. We're already on a trajectory towards 2.5 or 3 degrees by the end of this century. But what's important is what's on the next graph. This is a graph that Johan Rockström shared at New York Climate Week. Where we are is beyond anything that the human race or any other living creature or nature has experienced on this planet. We're already there. That is the level of the crisis. And human beings cannot survive at extreme temperatures of 40 to 50 degrees. That's the threshold for survival. But it's much lower temperatures in places that have high levels of humidity. So if you've got humidity of 70 or 80%, like you have in places like Singapore, the actual tolerable temperature is about 30 degrees, possibly 35 degrees, much, much, much lower. And the other big problem is if nighttime temperatures remain high. So this is a now issue, and those are the three things that we have to remember. 40 to 50 degrees, 30 to 35 degrees in areas of high humidity, and if nighttime temperatures are high. And all those alarm bells are sounding very loudly. WEF estimates that 60,000 people will die annually due to heat by 2030. Now, to put that into context, that's the number of people who died in the Turkey-Syria earthquake in February last year. And that was the 5th deadliest earthquake this century. But we're talking about that happening every single year and getting worse. But as Sami pointed out, next, go back a bit, people are impacted in other ways. Extreme events aren't just about loss of life, they're about health and well-being, they're about loss of productivity because people can't work, they're about loss of livelihoods, they're about food production going down. So the knock-on effects of extreme heat are huge. And nature also suffers. There's all this work going on to promote the nature positive agenda to make sure our forests can contribute to climate change. But plants and animals can't thrive if the world is getting hotter either. So it's actually a very, very vicious negative feedback loop. The other impact is on the critical infrastructure that underpins modern life. Over the last year, we've seen roads and runways melting in extreme heat. We've seen metro systems in cities break down because of the ventilation in trains. We've seen power outages, which then knock on to failures in water supply and failures of cooling systems. The number of cities exposed to temperatures of 35 degrees is expected to triple by 2050. We talk about the livability of cities, and we've talked about that referring to affordability, amenities, connectivity, culture and sustainability. Also safety. I believe we're going to be talking very quickly, not about the livability of cities, but about the habitability of cities. That's simply, are they safe to live in? So, who is the most affected? Next. Every city needs to understand who and what is impacted by heat and take action to mitigate the consequences. Hence, over the last few years, we've seen some cities taking the lead, appointing city heat officers. And there's an event over the road in the Resilience Hub, which my good friend Jorge Gastelumundi from the Atlantic Council is leading, which is bringing together some of those heat officers. What we know, and we know from our experience working in cities, is it's the elderly and the young and the most vulnerable. And some of you know that. Those of you who have raised children or looked after elderly people, we know that young people and old people, they can't cope in the way that adults can cope. And so we've got to put particular focus on schools and hospitals and care homes and residential property. And that is really difficult because those are sectors that have been often overlooked and they're very, very fragmented and spread out. They're not like a neat, tidy program of work for intervention. And that this requires a different approach. We also, we also need to really think about the 1 billion people living in formal settlements and the 500 million people living in inadequate housing. That's 20% of the global population. A chunk of my career was in emergency shelter, humanitarian shelter. I know that the primary role of shelter is to provide protection from the environment, from rain, from cold, from wind, and from heat. But typically shelters in informal settlements and in humanitarian situations have uninsulated corrugated iron roofs with no insulation. What happens is the temperatures are raised and they turn shelters into ovens. And we're not talking about 10 degrees difference, we're talking about 15 degrees difference. I want to jump up a scale and talk about the urban heat island effect. The way we design and plan and build cities makes things worse. Now, we've been exploring this in Arup, really in terms of the urban heat island effect. And this describes the warmer temperatures that urban areas experience compared to their rural surroundings. It's projected that those effects will be worse in the coming decades because we will densify cities, build taller buildings, and there'll be more waste heat from cars, etc. And that's especially problematic in Asian and African cities. But we worked with 2 universities and using Earth observation data, combined with the physics of radiant heat at ground level, we've developed a digital platform called U-Heat. And what's important about U-Heat is the temperature that people experience on the ground. It's not just about the temperature, it's about the experience temperature of individuals. And we've mapped heat islands, next one, in 9 cities, ranging from Mumbai to Madrid, Cairo to Singapore, and to Brisbane. And we did that work on the hottest day in those cities in 2022. The temperature differential in those cities was as much as 10 degrees. But what I really want to point out is that in every city, the highest temperatures were always where the most vulnerable communities live, because they were always in the areas of low quality, dense housing where there wasn't open spaces, parks and water bodies. Heat is a resilience issue, heat is an equity issue. So, more positively, this panel is about the solutions, but we can't talk about the solutions without breaking down the problem and really understanding what it's about. So what are the solutions next? If we want to keep warm, we know what to do. We put on layers of clothes, and then we put the heating system on in the building because we want to keep our energy bills low. And we do it in that order. To keep cool, we also need layers of protection. We need solutions that start with individuals and educating people about heat. When temperatures hit 40 degrees in London a couple of years ago, I realized that the majority of Londoners did not know that when temperatures are that high, you close the windows in the morning and you close the curtains to keep the hot air out. That is the basics that we've got to get across to people. It's no different to typhoon warnings in Hong Kong. The second thing is legislation. This is beginning, but we need legislation to protect particularly outdoor workers who have been asked to work in extreme heat. They need their human rights protected so that they're not obliged to continue to work when temperatures become extreme. Then we need to get on to the building scale solutions. Next one. The answer is not just air conditioning. In many countries, air conditioning is no longer a luxury, but it's an imperative for human health. There are 2 billion air conditioning units in the world already, and that's expected to get to 5.6 by 2050. But that in itself poses a lot of different issues. There's the issue of increased energy demand, and that's competing with energy demand from EVs in electric vehicles. So ACs and EVs are going to be sucking up energy, competing with data centers. But the people who have those air conditioning units, they can't actually afford the bills to run those air conditioning units any more than people can afford heating bills in cold countries now. But perhaps the biggest risk is the lack of recognition that heat also causes power outages. I would not want to be living in a building that is totally reliant on air conditioning if there was also a risk of a power outage, because there's then no plan B. So we have to look to passive solutions for buildings. I'm talking about insulating, keep going, next slide, insulating roofs. This next slide is a project that we've done with Roof Over Our Heads in Surat in India. And it is working with local people in informal settlements, bringing our expertise in environmental and building physics, using waste materials from that informal settlement to build sandwich panels which the communities can build themselves. The temperature differentials in their homes were 12 degrees lower. These solutions are not difficult. They require combining sort of education and science with local capacity. Similar reductions can result from putting PVs on roofs or painting them white, known as cool roofs. For bigger buildings, ventilated facades, keep going, incorporating greenery can be really, really effective. This is a very, very technical facade, but there are low-tech versions of this. And there's all different types of scales of buildings need to take on board. But facades are big areas of buildings. They're like roofs. Those are the two things that we need to look to treat. But then we need to look at solutions at a neighbourhood and a city scale next. Sammy talked about planting trees. Yes, we just need more and more and more trees. In my city, hometown of London, they cut down trees because they're worried about subsidence. We just need to put in trees that don't have wide root spread, and we can have the benefit of trees without the subsidence. But there are actually more basic solutions. Next one. We need to have open spaces with fountains and water bodies for cooling. We need to have emergency shelters with cooling on standby power, so that actually if air conditioning breaks down, people have somewhere to go. It's no different to the emergency shelters from cyclones. Next. And then when we're planning new cities, and particularly in places like Africa, or the MENA region, where there's a huge amount of city building going on, the most important thing is the planning of the cities, so you actually capture the prevailing winds, and there are gaps between the buildings that funnel those winds through the cities. This is how people used to design cities historically. They knew that empirically. It's just things that we've forgotten, and we need to bring back into urban planning. This is my last slide, and this is my final point. No single group can solve urban overheating. It's going to require engagement and action and community and city scale. It needs urgent changes to planning and building policy and standards. And I leave you with a quote from the London Resilience Review. Even a city as sophisticated as London, even a country like the UK, hasn't woken up to heat. The Climate Change Committee noted that over the last 4 years, 570 new homes have been built in the UK that are not resilient to higher temperatures. We've got a big retrofit build to make those homes safe. And in the next 5 years, the UK is planning to build 1.5 million homes. And at the moment, they're also going to lock in climate vulnerability unless planning and building policy is changed now. We need to act now, or that 3.8 billion people which is about half the world's population, just under, are going to really be in big trouble, and very, very soon. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Peter Vangsro, who's now going to moderate our amazing panel of speakers.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you so much, Sammy, for this framing before we're going into the panel discussion. But before the panel is coming up, I actually have an exercise for all you audience. So I have a 20-second exercise, and I kindly ask you to take your hand like this, all of you, and try to feel the cool flow coming into your hands, and be thinking about the consequences of that cooling coming into the palm of your hand. It's quite an amazing journey that we are on when we are thinking about the complexity of cooling. And this is precisely leading to our panel discussion here, because we are going to talk about intervention. So let me introduce the entire panel. BJ Zhang from the municipality of Singapore. You are you're the director for energy and climate policy. Have a previous research background, and I think that multidisciplinary approach is really the center of our conversation here later on. Jasmine Sumunko, my fellow half Dane in the panel. Jasmine is an architect and will be talking about both the indoor and the outdoor complexity of urban heat. Jasmine, you're the director of Zero Energy Passive Housing Association in Turkey. Welcome to the panel. And Farouk Shah from Schneider Electric, located in Dubai, head of sustainability in APEC and in the Middle East region. Welcome to the panel. And finally, we have Mira Atala, head of adaptation and resilient at UNEP. So, guys, we have a special code here with the mic. In order for the entire audience to listen, you have to hold the mic as it was a flower. Okay. So, Vijay, I will start with you. Now we have been listening to these amazing intervention, but let me hear a little bit more about the intervention that you're working with right now on the complexity of urban heat in Singapore. I'll give each of you here in the panel 4 minutes to present the work that you are actually doing now.
Thank you very much, Peter, and very good afternoon to everyone here. I am Wei Jie. I'm the Divisional Director for Energy and Climate Policy at the Singapore Ministry of Sustainability and Environment. I think some of you have already heard from Joe's presentation earlier and know a little bit about Singapore now, but this is a bit of context. Singapore is a very small country, just very close to the equator. We are about 700 square kilometers, about 40 kilometers from east to west and 20 kilometers from north to south. Very small country, but very densely populated with about 6 million people. The challenge that we have is we have to fit. We're a city, we're a country, we're a nation. We fit all our needs in this small little island of about 700 square kilometers, housing, industry, and spaces for people to live in. And in this very dense environment, we have to deal with the issue of heat because we are near the equator and we also have very high levels of humidity. When we do our climate science projections, we know Singapore will feel that the effects of heat very, very strongly by the end of this decade. We're already heating at about a 1/4 degree every decade. So for every 40 years, the average temperature of Singapore rises by 1 degree Celsius. With climate change, this will accelerate, and we were looking at doubling the rate of heating, so about half a degree every decade. And if we look at the end of this century, by 2100, you look at the number of days where the maximum temperature will exceed 35 degrees Celsius. Our climate scientists tell us that about 300 of those days will see a maximum temperature of 35 degrees Celsius and above. So what are we doing about it? What have we been doing about it? I'll talk a little bit about 3 areas. One, really, in terms of the interventions in terms of building and urban design. Secondly, on raising community resilience. And thirdly, really how we leverage science and technology. Firstly, on urban planning and infrastructure design, we have really started thinking about how, actually we've already been designing our buildings in the north-south orientation to maximize wind flow. I think Joe mentioned a lot about that. When we plan buildings and we plan cities and neighborhoods, we really think about how we safeguard spaces for winds and shade. Then secondly, greenery. We've, as part of the Singapore Green Plan, by 2030, we are planning to plant 1 million more trees. We are about 70% through with that target. But we've also introduced schemes by the government to incentivize building developers to introduce more greenery in the facades of buildings. Thirdly, in terms of cool materials, we are also exploring the use of cool materials, for example, cool paints in buildings. In some neighborhoods, it has been proven to be able to reduce ambient temperature by about 2 degrees Celsius. And fourthly, in terms of reducing the heat that we generate, we talked a little bit about air conditioning. But if we centralize that and we really embark on district cooling, we can really help to reduce the energy needs for these buildings by quite a lot. In the area of community resilience, we've really started thinking about how to raise the community's resilience. And this comes with empowering the people to make decisions. We've rolled out a general population advisory, heat stress advisory. It comes to your phone. It tells you, with the combined effects of heat, temperature, air temperature, and humidity, what it feels like to you and what measures you need to take, especially for the elderly and for very young people. On top of that, we've worked with a lot of sectoral agencies to layer on effects, for example, for outdoor workers, for people who have just returned from long vacations or long periods in temperate countries. How do you want to do acclimatization? And how do you get used to that high temperature and high heat, humidity again? And lastly, in terms of science and tech, I'll speak a little bit about that in my last minute. We've begun work, I think Joe showed a slide on that just now, but really thinking about how do we model some of these effects. If we put all these effects together, what is the potential effect in terms of reducing our temperature for Singapore? We've embarked on a research project called Cooling Singapore, and that really puts all that together and models those effects, and that has really helped to feed into urban planning and how we plan for our city. So that's in a nutshell of what we've been doing. I'm happy to take more questions later.
Thank you so much, Vijay. But before we are going over to Jasmine, I just want to, and it's completely unfair, but can you come with, like, what do you feel is the one most strongest intervention that you have pushed in Singapore on urban heat or reducing urban heat?
Sure. I think because we are a tropical country, we're used to doing a lot of these things on the infrastructure and building side. But one thing that I think we really need to push more on is the area of community resilience. We've talked a lot about this. For us, it's not really a matter of equity, because we do all these measures, we take all these measures nationwide. But we really, when we think about it in Singapore, we really think about it in terms of how it affects livability, how it affects how we design our city. I mean, we don't really want to be a city where people come out of an air-conditioned building, hop into an air-conditioned vehicle, and get to another place, because that completely affects the tenor of the society. It affects how people live, how people work, and how people interact with each other.
Perfect.
And I think that's one big push that we really want to make in terms of helping people adjust to that and maintain a certain vibrancy of a city.
Thanks. Thank you so much, PJ. Jasmine, this is really straight on to you. We're talking about here keeping community cool. You're working with architecture, passive housing, that aspect of around the neighborhood. How do you work with that when you are designing passive housing?
I would like to answer you in two dimensions. First, on regulatory basis, and then on technical basis. What the Turkish Standards Institute has recently done is that we had previously 4 climate zones in Turkey, and these climate zones were depending only on heating degree days. So now they have updated the climate zones to 6 zones, and we have included the cooling degree days, which makes a huge difference in terms of regulations. That's one aspect. And when we look at the technical aspect, it's very important to use the proper U values of building materials and components. And when I talk about U values, I mean the heat transfer of the building components. The lower the U value is, the better for us in terms of both heating and cooling. And this enables us as designers and architects to select a whole range of materials when we look at the U values. So we can select the local products, we can select the low carbon materials, and we can select the nature-based materials if we look at the U values. So, as I described it, low U values, high performance windows, and when we are looking at the high performance windows, it's also very important to look at the G value, how much radiation we are going to accept in the building. But also we have to take care of how much the glass is going to reflect. So we take care of the neighboring buildings, because lately we have seen that there are many buildings which are constructed, and they put these glasses with high reflectance, which are reflecting the radiation directly to other buildings, cars, and they are melting down the cities. This is a very important point to take care of. This is in terms of new buildings. Also, if you look at the existing buildings, to our building stock, of course, there's a challenge in Turkey, because we are an earthquake-prone country. So, first of all, we have to make our buildings both earthquake resistant and climate resistant. So we are looking at it in 2 dimensions. If a building has been constructed according to the regulations of today, then we are making deep renovation to these buildings. And then cultural heritage buildings are very important, because there the technique we are using is very different than the average building. So whether we are going to insulate the building from outside or inside, that's the critical point. And over there we have a issue. We have to work with the engineers, because not many engineers would like to make implementation inside the walls, because there the technique is different and they don't know. And due to lack of knowledge, there's condensation appearing. But today, with the know-how we have, with the technology we have, we can easily overcome these spots where we are detailing properly. Once we have been completing the building envelope, then of course, with climates where we have excess humidity, we will definitely need mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. But this is now we have the technology also, and we can connect the ventilation with the dehumidifier, so we will achieve the internal comfort in these buildings. Thank you.
And Jasmine, I will ask you the same question as VJ. If you could, after the terrible earthquake you had in Turkey, if you could do one intervention in the rebuild of such a catastrophe to address urban heating, what would that be? What would that one step be? The most important thing, the most important intervention you could imagine?
Actually, thank you for this question. I have an answer for it. Actually, it's not something I would like to do, we are doing. At the moment, we are working on a project with the post-earthquake cities. We started with 4 cities, and now it's 6 cities. So we are empowering women with clean energy technologies. So we are having workshops, capacity building activities, and we are working with them how they can reach finance. Because the problem here is people are mentored, people are trained, but it is very important to let people find the finance for these kind of interventions. And that's the high time for it.
And thank you so much for that reply, because this is really the essence of the panel and the discussion here today. We cannot solve this by one institute at a time. We really need to see this in a holistic way. We really need to work in partnership to address the complexity of urban heating. We really need to have all actors, from architects to solution providers to global institutions to progressive cities who can work together in partnerships. This is one of the things that Arup are really pushing, trying to look at these global problems in a partnership perspective. Bringing in the solution provider, Farad, I would like to start hearing a little bit about what do you feel of the most important intervention from a Schneider Electric perspective? Could you give us a little bit of flavor, because you are working in such a broad region, the different aspects that you are working with?
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm representing Schneider Electric, and I take care of a region which is very interesting, Asia Pacific, India, and Middle East Africa. Now, if you Google the top 20 hottest countries in the world, they all fall into my region, interestingly. And I was listening very intently to Joe's presentation on that as well. There's a lot of challenges, of course, related to heat. One of these statistics I will tell you is whenever there's a standard deviation of 1 point in temperature, there's a rise of 4% at least on conflict and violence. So there is a clear correlation between the rising temperature and heat with the behaviors of people. And of course, in this aspect, it is linked to violence and conflict. But at the same time, there are a lot of least developed countries in my zone as well. And again, to give you some statistics, they contribute 4% to the global emissions, but they have an impact of 24% of climate impact on those countries. Hence, there is an urgent need to move forward with some solutions, whether we're talking about retrofitting buildings.
Goes to your mic.
Sure.
Yeah.
Whether you talk about retrofitting buildings, you're talking about district cooling systems, but what it dramatically needs is a partnership, because sustainability and the path to net zero is a team sport. It is not an individual sport, which means like a good team, everybody has to play a role. Here I'm talking about policy making, I'm talking about private sector, I'm talking about non-profit, I'm talking about governments. And sadly, in a lot of these countries that I'm taking care of and responsible for, and there's some good examples as well. Singapore is one of them, by the way. All this partnership is not working, right? Because there are different roles of different bodies which don't come together to come into play. Now, as Schneider Electric, we are playing a role. We have very close partnership, for example, in Singapore, and we spoke earlier on this topic with the Singapore government. We work jointly on sustainability services. We work jointly on solutions on smart buildings and smart cities. We do that as well. Hence, we're looking at developing all the different partnerships with different government bodies in different countries. One of the key areas, as Schneider, I can tell you, is we have a very clear roadmap on how we want to move forward, provide access to energy to 1 million people by 2030. And a lot of that is in India, a lot of that is in Africa, and we are well on path for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Farouk. This is actually my first day at COP, and when you are in COP, you really need to be diplomatic. I'm also a Dane, and it's not always that the Danes are so diplomatic. And Farouk, I'm sorry, I have to be a little bit direct here, because a lot of the solution providers, they're offering the cool flow that we could feel in our hand and which we are enjoying. But a lot of the technology is also causing increase of heat in urban areas. How do you, as a company, provide a service, cool indoor space, but contribute to heat outdoor?
I like the directness. Clearly, you see, Schneider, and I'll tell you some of our. I want to go back to some of our commitments. We were rated by the Time magazine as the most sustainable company in the world in 2024, and part of the reason is that we have a very clear sustainability impact index in the organization. We have this mantra that you do well to do good, right? Which means that we balance performance of our organization, the profitability of the company, the business, with doing good for the society and the planet as well. So we are balancing that. We are not saying it is one or the other. We're saying this and this. So that is the mantra. We do well to do good. At the same time, we have a clear 12 criterias on our sustainability index on what are the key commitments we have. And I can tell you, as part of the leadership team in the company, my bonus is linked to that. All right, and all the leaders in the company, they have their short-term incentive plans linked to the sustainability index. That's how seriously we take that. Now, of course, I don't want to bore you with the details. We have a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2025. In our operations, by 2030, we want to provide access to energy to 1 million people. By 2040, we have a commitment to be carbon neutral across our value chain, keeping in mind that Scope 3 is 95% or 97% of our emissions. And then by 2050, we want to be net zero. So we are well on path for that. We have a very stringent process to make sure that we are tackling everything, and the leadership is fully involved in it as well.
Thank you so much, and it's always I can be direct because I know that you are doing so well. So I know that you have an answer ready. It's really interesting to hear how you have adopted performance-based sustainability targets into your organization as part of leadership. And Mira, is that from a unit perspective, you're working with resilience and climate adaptation? Is that some of these global trend when we're talking about urban heat that you can also on a global scale press to a change of leadership? And after you have answered that, then I would really like also to hear a little bit about UNEP's interventions on urban heat. But if you can just start perhaps giving your view on Farouk's comments on the leadership aspects.
Sure, thank you very much. And unfortunately, I'm a very cold sensitive person, so I like heat. But maybe not to the degree of not to 50-degree heat. That being said, the UN Secretary General launched a call to action on extreme heat earlier this year, that has gained quite a bit of traction, in particular in attracting attention of leaders all around the world on the issue of extreme heat. At the same time, in parallel, on Scope 3, for instance, we have the SG's expert panel report on high integrity of carbon markets. So looking at really pushing and making sure that we're not going straight into offsets, but rather mitigating and abating first before any offsets are undertaken, but also looking at transparency in emission reductions across supply, transactions, and demand, so that we don't want to have any hot air out there. And that is the title of our emissions gap report this year, that is really flagging the fact that it's not only about the markets, but it's also about the commitments transitioning to implementation and to action. And so we are seeing as a transition in that direction across leadership, both in government, in cities and subnational governments, as in particular subnational jurisdictions. There's a very, very strong uptake with that desire to not only have commitments, but also transitions those commitments into action. And I think that, with the private sector as well, we have a number of, similar to the Cool Coalition and to the Global Alliance on Buildings and Construction, we also have different alliances on the finance side, like GFANS, for instance, or the task force on the transparency and disclosure on climate action and nature action now, in terms of where funding is flowing and what real actions are being taken. So we're doing our best to create a space for transparency, accountability, and action as well.
And Mira, if we are making a little bit of a deep dive onto the interactions, and perhaps as we talked about partnerships with different stakeholders, how does UNEP work with developing resilient cities against urban heat in partnerships? The more specific interventions, I would really like to hear that.
So maybe I'll take it at different scales, and I will start with this. That pavilion and what it represents is an example of what we're doing at the global scale in terms of bringing together different partners and different stakeholders, from government to private sector to cities to funding institutions and international kind of standard setting organizations. At a lower scale, if I can put it this way, we're working quite a bit. If I can give the example of Cambodia, for instance, we've supported the government of Cambodia with approaches in terms of putting in place a passive cooling strategy nationwide, but then also training architects, training engineers, training designers in terms of how to implement that passive cooling strategy and how to unfold it. We've supported with putting in place building codes and testing new construction materials and approaches as well, to see how, to demonstrate and to pilot the small scale interventions that can be upscaled, but also we've looked at the financial arrangements in relation to that. And maybe I'd like to emphasize 3 points. Point number one.
1 minute.
1 minute, yes. Point number one, on building codes. We can't have building codes for insulation, for energy efficiency, for flood-prone areas, for earthquakes, all being separate building codes. We need really integration across the board. And so that is something that we're taking very much at heart. Second, on finance, there's a potential for innovating in retrofitting and in buildings efficiency, similar to what we had done in terms of energy efficiency of light bulbs. When we did that whole retrofitting, there's a potential to transfer that experience into the buildings as well. And third, I think we all need to work together on behavior and mentality change, because oftentimes what Yasmin was mentioning is perceived as being progress, or what Joe was referring to in terms of the old ways of designing cities or buildings is perceived as, outdated and we need to move on. But in fact, there's so much wisdom in traditional approaches and in many cases in indigenous approaches that we really need to work together on changing that mindset.
Great. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting perspective. You're giving me hope when you're doing your presentation. So thank you so much for that. I was not really getting so much hope when I met Johan Rockstorm the Swedish scientist, because his message was really, really clear. It was, buckle up. This is going to be rough. And I think this is also what Sammy and Joe presented earlier. We are facing some consequences we don't know the scale of. So I will just take 2 more rounds, but it will go a little bit quicker, so you just have 2 minutes each. I will start with you, JV. Sorry, JV. VJ. VJ, what is your step to prevent that this urban heat is sprawling out of control? What would the most crucial intervention be from you? And before you are answering that, then I would like to make a kind of a deep dive. Singapore are doing amazingly on reducing urban heat. But where do you look for inspiration? Where do you see cities are very progressive in this?
Thank you, Peter. I think we talked a little bit about what are some of the things that is that on my wish list to push harder. But maybe I would talk a little bit about the theme of partnership here, because we talked a lot about partnerships within a country between, say, public policy practitioners, with engineering firms, with think tanks and all that stuff. But I think there's a case to be made for international partnerships here, because heat can be a global issue, but it can also have very regional dimensions. For example, in Southeast Asia, the 10 countries deal with heat very differently. In Singapore, we experience heat all year round. But in a country like Vietnam, they experience seasonal heat. And in those instances, sometimes it's the rapid change of temperature from a cooler season to a hotter season that creates heat stress for the population. And I think herein I would like to make a pitch for actually countries to work together a little bit more in partnership. Last year at COP, Singapore, the National University of Singapore announced that we're going to set up a global heat health information network. And this is really working with countries in Southeast Asia to exchange data about how we see climate projections going from now to the end of the century, the kind of issues that we deal with differently, and also to exchange best practices about how we can work together more effectively to tackle issues not only with regard to urban design, with building design, but also with regard to how we make interventions for the population in the areas of equity, in the areas of livability, and exchange that information and build such partnerships together. Because I think that within nations we can do this much. I think as we exchange ideas across national boundaries, I think we can achieve a lot more.
Great. Thank you, Vijay. And just to repeat my question again, is there a place where you are looking towards to get inspired or to see a trend in this? Are there a country or region which are doing really well, or a different approach than Singapore?
Well, I think we're looking at a lot of different countries, but for our context, because we are a tropical country, we're looking a lot at countries in near the equator as well, and actually very densely urban built-up environments. Like ours, so we have a huge focus on cities, not so much both in terms of how they sometimes contribute to the problem through urban heat island effects, but also can very much be a part of the solution, for example, by crowding in financing solutions for innovative heat mitigation measures.
Yeah, thank you. And Farouk, APEC and MENA is a very large region, so I guess that you know really some of the cities which are hit hardest by urban heating. So what is the step to prevent urban heating in the most vulnerable cities that you are familiar with in APEC, MENA?
Sure. I just moved into Dubai 2 months ago, and I was very impressed with the district cooling service providers in Dubai and how they have moved ahead in the last 10 years or so. And to me, that's a way forward. And I think that is something that needs to be replicated across. I don't think it is fully replicated across the whole of Middle East, but I see Dubai as leading the way with them. I somewhere saw one of the sponsors from there as well. Secondly, I think in Asia, in East Asia, there's a huge stock of buildings, and we need to do retrofitting of buildings to make them smart, to make sure they're energy efficient, to make sure that they are using the right platforms, automated platforms, AI-based platforms, to get to know what's happening in those buildings, because they're super legacy-based, old conventional buildings, and there's a huge stock. I'm talking about Hong Kong. I've lived in Hong Kong for 10 years. I can tell you that is the way forward in those cities. Then you talked about Vietnam. Now, of course, the new buildings that are being built, they're smart. I understand that. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done on retrofitting. Now, retrofitting is a huge topic because who's going to pay for it? What is going to be the ROI? And that's where we need proper partnership going with financial institutions, with policymakers, with governments, to make sure that we are looking at the stock of buildings which needs retrofit.
And just super short, when we're talking about retrofitting, we're talking about insulation materials in the MENA region, which are not a common thing. What type of retrofit intervention?
I'm looking at everything. I'm looking at energy efficient solutions, right from your lighting to your systems to your building management system, to using automated platforms. I can tell you, like at Schneider, we have a platform called EcoStructure, but every company has a platform which is basically managing your building to see what is the energy output, where you can save, and what is happening. I think that is needed as well. Then, of course, insulated materials as well.
Yeah.
But I would go with let's make it smart. Let's make smart buildings.
Yeah. Jasmine, I would like to pass the mic to you, and if we start on retrofitting, you might just share a few of your insights on specific step that we can prevent from a retrofitting perspective.
I would like to talk a bit about the multidisciplinary approach. I believe we should involve psychologists and sociologists much more, because we are technical people and we have spent our time to understand. We are working with data, but any citizen who is a, let's say, butcher or a grocer will never know as much as we can. And how can we convince them if we have a very short time span? The best way would be to find a new way of communication with them and to work with fashionable trends. For example, what we are experiencing lately in Turkey is that, okay, we have the regulations. I talked about how we are progressing, but suddenly in the Aegean coast and at the Mediterranean coast, we are seeing buildings where they are using black stone, dark gray stone. And in the municipality regulation, it says that you are going to paint the building white. And suddenly, why are we coming with these? And this goes back to the discussion on we have the ancestral knowledge, wisdom, and why are we not using them? That's one side of it. And the second side of it is how to use the data properly, because we are talking about also climate mitigation, adaptation, and we have to, if a building has a time span of 50 to 70 years, then we have to foresee the climate data of the coming decades, and we have to adapt them to our designs from today. So, of course, regulatory-wise, we need to push the issue. One final thing is, yes, finance models. It's somehow quite difficult to move the financial institutions to all these retrofitting and ideas. But for example, we have quite innovative models like the ESCO model, and we are pushing that a lot. And next year we are going to have the international second ESCO symposium in Istanbul, where we are going to bring lots of decision makers, so we can have a fruitful and concrete results from that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. The ESCO model is something we will return to, but first I will just point out the culture aspects on how we perceive heat. That's quite interesting. Just from a very popular way of saying it, I was eating breakfast here this morning with Joe De Silva, and she asked me, "Do you mind to sit in the sun? Is it not too hot for you?" I'm coming from Denmark. We haven't seen the sun for the last 2 weeks. I enjoyed seeing the sun, and that culture is really interesting in the Middle East, Farouk. It's common ground that when you are indoor, it have to be 18, 19, 20 degrees. If that was the case in Denmark, people will complain. So that whole cultural dimension, I think we kind of need to look into that aspect, and I think also Joe presented that really well. It's not about one homogeneous society. It's very diverse on how we perceive it. But Mira, I will just like to continue what Jasmine was saying regarding the ESCO model. Is that one of the step forward? And please elaborate from a unit perspective on the financial aspects to prevent that this urban heat is sprawling out of control.
Yes, I mean, I think I hinted to that earlier when I was talking about transposing what we have done on energy efficient light bulbs into energy efficient buildings, and that's exactly what it is. It's working with the energy supply companies and looking at different tariffs and different modes of payments to address precisely the point that you raised, which is return on investment. Because whether it's for adaptation and resilience or for retrofitting, the case is not one of financial returns. It's one of long-term economic savings. And how do you make that financial and business case is actually through those financial mechanisms and transfers from, you know, your energy bill into your retrofitting bill, and providing the tax incentives and the financial and fiscal incentives that actually go with that. Yeah. And in that sense, just to connect to the question that you asked, it's what we do as well. We have what we call generation restoration cities. It's currently 23 cities that are working in order to introduce nature back into urban planning. Istanbul is one of the generation restoration cities role models, and what we see is that the peer-to-peer learning, that's one of the things that we're facilitating, works super well. And it's not only working in terms of, you know, horizontal transfer, so tropical forest country or city to other tropical forest city. The city of Paris came to us saying, we don't know how to deal with heat. We need to learn from cities in the south. So now the knowledge exchange, the technology transfer is also happening, you know, in all different directions. And that is something that we're very excited about.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I would like to just have a 2-minute feedback from you from a very personal angle. Myself, I've been working many years in the Middle East, and I actually tried to get a heat stroke, and it was it came as a surprise that me, a healthy guy, could get a heat stroke, and I was sick for several days. I would like to hear perhaps you, Farouk. How have this? Could you give me a little bit of your personal story? Been brought up in Pakistan, have been working in Hong Kong, now in Dubai. How have you seen this urban heat trend throughout your life, and what heat indicators have you observed throughout your life?
Sure. I'll give you a point of view. You know, born in Pakistan, lived a while, and then moving around. The level of awareness on the topic is super low. I can tell you straight away. You feel heat, but you don't see what it is doing, what is the impact, and how it is evolving. You will seldom find Singaporeans complain about heat in Singapore. I can tell you that, right? but it has an effect, right? And where it is going, and I see the same in all the countries I've lived in. You will not find an Arab talking about heat when you meet them in the first 5 minutes that it's so hot, but you will immediately find an expat in Dubai talking about heat, right? But the local population will talk about something which is affecting them, like floods, right? We'll immediately talk about that. So I think we need to build more awareness on the environment and what is happening around it. I don't think urban heating, heat islands, the awareness is very high in all the places that I've lived in, and I think awareness in general population needs to be built on what is the topic and what is being done around it as well. And I think that awareness is something that I would look at. Now, of course, as private organizations, we work with clients and we have these discussions. But I think as public companies or as governments, I think this is something that needs to be done. I see education and awareness is a big topic that is missing.
Great, and that was precisely the step to you, Vijay. You have a research background, and now you're a policymaker. So, being a researcher in this field and a policymaker, could you give a little bit of light into your personal story, this journey that you have been on?
Sure. I actually was going to reflect on your story about heat stroke, but I'll come to that later. Before I got into the Ministry of Sustainability and Environment, I was the Director for Strategy at the National Research Foundation. And this is really thinking about what kind of science and tech solutions we need to really invest in for the future, and really go by three considerations. One, excellent science. Two, relevance to Singapore. And three, global impact. And heat was one of the issues we really identified as hitting all three considerations. Something that we could see on the horizon. We felt in Singapore that we need to really look at the next bound of how we can tackle that, and then put in place solutions, try it out, and hope to really scale it up. And I think that has really helped the work that I'm doing here in my ministry right now. But on your story about heat stroke, I was going to say that in my past life, many more years ago, I was also a military commander in the Singapore Armed Forces, because all male citizens go through military service. One of the biggest nightmares we always prepare for is the issue of heat stroke, because you have soldiers with you. We go out into the field, and we have been trained to really think about precautions to take to raise the resilience of our soldiers for heat. And I want to say that actually for heat, even when we talk about it here, it's a thing that we can build resilience for. There is a capacity issue. We can raise our social economic capacity to deal with heat, our physiological capacity to deal with heat, and in turn, societal capacity to deal with it. And I think with the right policies in place, we can really do that. So I thought that would be my message for today.
Thank you so much, Vijay. And Mira, what about you? Your most severe personal experience on urban heat, if any?
Well, I'm not
of
sure.
Family members?
I have a very high tolerance to heat, and I don't know if it's because I'm in menopause or what, but I'm not sure. But I think that the real important point here, from my point of view, is that how we experience heat and cold is very individual and very personal. And just going back to the point that Joe was making earlier, while we can layer up when we're cold, we need to think about how do we layer down as well, and how do we create those spaces of insulation and comfort for when there is extreme heat and people that suffer from it.
Thank you. And I would like to close this panel session with you, Jasmine. Turkey have been really through a huge development. The cities are much more condensed now. Can you give a little bit from your personal life? What kind of heat indicators have you observed through your upbringing?
Yes, actually the last 20 years, the major economical driving in Turkey is construction, which makes life, quite difficult for us, because a proper design and proper implementation takes time. and you have to talk with the stakeholders from the beginning until the end. And when you have a very massive construction going on, it may be quite difficult to get everyone to understand what you are trying to do and what the implications can be afterwards. So, of course, as I said, we are working quite a lot with the ministries, with the decision makers. But personally, being a person who had very many heat strokes at childhood, because I used to be always in the street and at the beach. I really played a lot in the street once upon a time, and today the children, they are not out as much as we are, so they do not have the experience we had once upon a time. It is very important that the decision makers and the role models in the society live the way they are trying to impose people. So when people are coming to me and say, Yasin, what can we do? What kind of projects can we do? I say, first of all, leave your car and use public transportation, because then you will also understand the average person, what they feel when they are using a public transportation. And I personally have never used an air conditioner in my houses, wherever in Turkey I lived. It's because, and whenever people came to my house, they said, oh, your house is nice and you don't need an air conditioner. Yes, because we have the knowledge. Just, it's important to use it. Don't go through the fashion, go through wisdom and know-how, and that's what we need.
Perfect. I think this is a very, very good closing for a brilliant panel. So I think, audience, please help me giving our audience a big applause. Thank you, Vijay, Mira, Farouk, and Jasmine. If you would like to just take a seat here, then the most difficult task of this discussion today is to kind of wrap it up as a Christmas present and come with some suggestions of going forward. And no better than our director for sustainability in Arup, Joe De Silva, will try to make that task. Thank you, Joe.
I'm only going to say a few words. I really wanted to start by saying thank you to all the panelists, to Peter, to Same, to Erin Gill, who is there, for organising such a great panel. What matters about this panel is the diversity of organisations on it. I hope you heard what I heard, which is that everyone, whether it's a technology provider from the private sector, someone from government who was previously in academia, someone who is in academia, everyone's holds a piece of the jigsaw. My mother always told me that understanding the problem is halfway to the solution. We really do understand the problem. What excites me about this is that it's a problem that could create unity. That's what's been lacking in the whole climate agenda. And the solution, the rest of it, is radical collaboration. And that's collaboration between all sorts of different organizations. And we heard that so much today, the need to share global experience with local knowledge. Zhang talked about the need for cities to share experiences in countries, like with each other. Farouk talked about a team sport. But a team sport, everyone actually does know their role, which I really loved. We can't do it alone. The founder of Arup was called Ovi Arup, and one of the things he talked about was the need to join hands with others fighting for the same values. And really, we're all here at COP because we're trying to join hands, and the 60,000 I was told today was 80,000 people here. If we can work out how to join hands and turn ourselves into a team, we'll get there. But I really do believe that this is the key thing, the key to the climate crisis is addressing heat, because it's the thing that's going to have the biggest impact in the shortest period of time and have the biggest knock-on effects in terms of nature, in terms of our built environment. So we've got to take it very, very seriously. Thank you all again for coming, and please do stay in touch with me, with Erin, with Peter, with Arup. We'd love to hear from you. we're just keen to keep the conversations going and the action happening. Thank you.